In this video, I'm going to show you how to remove the bearings of a bicycle headset. This will be done for the purpose of cleaning the bearings or for actually removing them to replace them. Since this procedure also involves removing the fork, this video can be a tutorial for fork removal as well. As far as cleaning your bearings, this is something that you need to do if you start to get some creaking in your headset. It's also something that you should probably do on a more routine basis every 4 to 6 months of riding in order to get the grit and sand out of the headset bearings so that they'll last longer. This is a pretty basic service and there's not a lot you're going to need to do it. You will need a 4 and 5 millimeter Allen wrench most likely. It's going to depend on your own stem and top cap, but usually it's going to be a 4 or 5. There's a slight chance it could be a 6 millimeter Allen wrench. You're probably going to need a 2.5 millimeter Allen wrench in order to remove the retaining device that holds your cable onto your fork. And if it's a Fox, and I think maybe even RockShox uses a 2.5 millimeter Allen wrench. You'll need some clean paper towels, you'll need some rubbing alcohol, and then you'll need just a little bit of grease. I always use the Philwood waterproof grease, but just a tiny bit to put a light coating on your bearings when you're putting everything back together. And this is a job that is made a lot easier with a work stand. So if you have a work stand, definitely use it for this job. It's not mandatory, but it does make it a lot easier. Since we will have to remove the fork, the first step is to undo the device that holds your cable onto the fork. And for a Fox fork, it just requires a 2 millimeter Allen wrench. When I do this, I don't totally remove that screw. I just loosen it enough to get the cable out. Then you'll want to remove the front wheel. The next thing that you need to do is remove the brake caliper. And most of you watching this are probably going to have disc brakes, and this is typically done with a 5 millimeter Allen wrench. If you have V-brakes, you're also going to need to undo the brake cable as well to get the fork off. I've already loosened this for the purpose of doing this video quickly, but on these you will typically have at least 1 or 2 washers or spacers. Some of them have quite a few washers and spacers, and in order to take the thinking out of reinstalling the brake cable, I take a rubber band and just wrap it around the bolts to hold them in place during this procedure. That way when it's time to reinstall this, you can just undo the rubber band and put it back on your fork. Now it's time to loosen the stem. And if you don't know how a stem works, the top cap is what compresses everything and keeps the headset tight. Then the pinch bolts on the stem will actually fasten the stem onto the fork. And so what I'm going to do first is loosen the pinch bolts. And whenever you do this, you want to do it a little bit at a time, whether it's loosening or tightening. That way one pinch bolt isn't too tight. So I'm just going to do about a 1/4 turn for each one so that these loosen evenly. And I want to make sure they're done all the way out. And you don't have to remove the bolt, but you do need it to be out so that everything is loose. And on this one it's a 4 millimeter. It's probably going to be a 4 or 5 millimeter Allen wrench for yours. Now what I'm going to do is loosen the top cap. And as I do that, I'm going to need to put my hand under the fork. Let me back this out a little bit so you can see me doing this. And the reason that you need to do that is once the top cap is loose, the fork could fall out. You're probably going to have some friction in there that's going to keep it together. But just in case, put your hand underneath the fork. So I'm going to loosen this one. And this is also a 4 millimeter. And again, it's probably going to be a 4 or 5. You know what, before I do that, let me give you a tip here. And that is, if you're new to this, I would take a few pictures. So use your cell phone, take a few pictures so you can see how your spacers are, and that way when you put it back together, you can know exactly how you had it together in the first place. Also, when we take the bearings out, it's also a good idea to take a few more pictures just so you know how everything goes back together on your headset, because every headset could be a slightly different configuration. So I've got the top cap loose, so again everything is loose, so the fork could in theory fall out. So I've removed my spacers, and now I'm just going to kind of twist the stem back and forth, and this will come out. And just be careful and when you put the stem down, because everything's going to kind of hang on with the cables, but you don't want it to just slam against your fork. So I'm going to remove these spacers. So whether you have 4 or 5 spacers or none, you are going to have a final final top cap that's going to be designed to kind of flange out and keep dirt out of your headset. So this is where I would start taking a few pictures with your cell phone if you're not too familiar with your headset. So I've got this top cap, and you're also going to have a wedge inside. And I'm going to kind of slide this out a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about. And just remember to put things back in the reverse order. So this is the wedge, and every headset is going to have one of these. And then this one also has a little rubber gasket to keep dirt out of the headset. Okay, I've still got my hand under the fork, okay, because you can see this thing's sliding up and down very easily. Now, I'm at the bearing, and this should probably be the last little component that comes out. Again, and I've said this several times, but just take a few pictures so you know how everything goes back together. Okay, so this is the bearing, and then I'm going to have a bearing on the bottom. So I'm going to let the fork slide out. Okay, there it is. Now, this bearing actually stayed up in the headset. Sometimes it will come off with the fork and sit on this race, is what it's called. Or sometimes it'll stay in the headset. So I'm just going to reach in there and pull the bearing out. Now, I have a pretty good amount of sand. You may have heard it when I pulled it out. So even though this this headset is pretty sealed, I've still got some sand that has gotten in the headset. So it's a good idea to do this, like I said, on a routine basis to get that grit out, and that'll make your bearings last longer. So now I've got the fork removed, and I'm just going to lay this kind of standing upright against my workbench. I always put my fork on a towel, and that, if you can see it, will just keep the bottom of the fork from getting scratched from putting it on cement or something like that. So I would recommend doing that. I'm going to clean the head cups. I'm just going to take a clean rag or clean paper towel, just put a little rubbing alcohol on it and wipe it out real good on the top and also the bottom. It's also a good idea to probably get up inside that head tube if you can reach, and just make sure there's no dirt or grit or sand up inside there. Also, using a clean rag or paper towel, we're going to use rubbing alcohol and clean off the bearings and just get all the grease off, all of the dirt, sand that gets on those. And I would clean every single little component that you took out. There's only a few, so just take a couple minutes, and you'll notice I'm putting them back on a clean paper towel. I would not put them directly on a workbench because you could have some dirt and stuff on your workbench. So clean paper towel, make sure everything is nice and clean. And obviously you're doing this if you're just cleaning the bearings and putting them back in your headset. If you are replacing them, then you don't need to clean the bearings, but I would still clean your spacers and gaskets and all that. Now, while I've got them out, I didn't mention this before, but this is the time where you want to just kind of feel if they're smooth. Okay, this should not be crunchy at all. So you can just turn this back and forth and make sure the bearings turn smoothly, and do this for the top and the bottom. And both of these are still very smooth, so no need to replace them. Just cleaning them is fine, and then I'm going to put them back in the headset. You're also going to want to grab your fork, and this is probably where you're going to have most of your dirt, is on the race that sits on top of the fork. So with the towel, paper towel, and rubbing alcohol, just get that race really clean, and also clean your steerer tube as well. Then we're going to reassemble everything, and before you start your reassembly, have everything within reach. You'll see that I have on my workbench my spacers and my 4 and 5 millimeter Allen wrench, because you're going to be holding the fork on as you put everything back together, and you want to be able to grab everything without having to, let go of the fork, because you really can't. So here's what we're going to do. We're just going to take a little bit of grease and put a very thin coating on the bottom bearing. And you don't want too much because too much will attract dirt. So I'm just going to go around, put the grease on. And now we're going to take the fork. So I'm going to pick the fork up. And I'm going to slide this on. The way this goes on is you'll see it's kind of angled at the top. And you want that to go up. So the more flat part, and usually you're going to have, you're going to be able to see the gasket on the bottom that protects the bearing. So that's going to go down on top of the fork on the race. Now I'm going to grab my stem, which is still kind of hanging, and I'm going to slide the fork up inside the head tube carefully. Now you want to get that bearing up inside there, okay? And actually I'm not going to grab the stem yet. I'm just going to kind of lay it back down. So what I did was I got the stem so it's not on the back side of the fork. You can't really see it in the video, but now let me just show it here. I've just got the stem kind of hanging down. Everything's held together obviously by your cables. And so now we're going to start putting everything back together. Okay, so now I didn't show this on the video. Well, let me take some grease. I was going to say you can actually put some grease on the top bearing, but I've got everything within reach, like I said, so I just put a little grease on my fingers. And I'm going to slide the top bearing into the cup, and you may have to kind of position that, move the steerer tube around a little bit to get it to seat down in there. So now it's down inside the top cap. I'm sorry, the top head cup. So it's down in there good, and now we're going to put our caps on. Okay, the next component that I'm going to put on is the little wedge. So that slides down in there with the wider flange facing up, and you're just going to kind of put that down inside the bearing. That will not fully wedge down inside the bearing until we tighten everything up. So just push it down there as far as you can. And on my headset, I've got this gasket, so I'm going to put this on. And now I'm going to slide my top cap on. And I've still got my hand on the fork. Okay. So that looks good. And now I'm going to put my spacers back on. And you may or may not have spacers. I do. I've got 2 on the bottom. And I'm going to put my stem on, still keeping the hand on the fork. Okay. And let me adjust the camera a little bit so you can see what I'm doing. And I've got my top 2 spacers that I'll put on, and the top cap. Now, for the top cap, what we're going to do is we're going to take our Allen wrench and just tighten that top cap down. Not too tight yet, just enough to hold everything together. At this point, you can remove your hand from the fork because the top cap is holding everything together. We're not going to line everything up until the bike's actually back on the ground. I'm going to go ahead and put the caliper back on. And if you took my tip here and used the rubber band, that will still be, the bolts will still be together, and the spacers and everything will be as they were when they came off. So I'm not going to tighten these all the way. I'm going to turn these bolts so that they touch the outer portion of the caliper, and then I'll back it out half a turn. Alright, so I've got the brake caliper back on the fork, and I've put the hose back in the retaining device there, and I'm going to put the front wheel on. And as you saw, I left the brake caliper just a little loose so it can move back and forth. That way you can line up your rotor, and then we'll get the front wheel axle tight, and then we'll tighten the brake caliper. Now, just as a tip to get the caliper lined up, I've still got it loose, and I'm going to squeeze the front brake, and I'm going to tighten each of these bolts pretty good that hold the caliper onto the fork. And most of the time that will line up your rotor inside the caliper. And I'm going to spin the wheel, and that did work. So now I'm going to squeeze the front brake again and fully tighten those to the normal torque specs for your caliper onto the fork. So now the front wheel is on, the caliper is lined up and tightened, and now we're going to tighten up and line up the headset. Okay, I've got my bike out of the work stand and on the ground, and I've still got the pinch bolts loosened on the stem, and the top cap is not tightened a whole lot, it's just a little snug. And then I'm going to just kind of put my knees around the tire and twist the handlebars until you line up the stem straight with the front tire. And this is more art than science, but I usually kind of look at the way the front wheel is with the down tube, or how the stem is with the front tire. And I've always said that Park needs to make a tool to do this, because you'll get it where you think it's lined up, and then you'll start riding and it's crooked. So just you can kind of move it back and forth. Just look, I'm looking at the stem and the front tire. Now I'm going to tighten the top cap. Okay, you want to get it pretty snug to where there's no play in the headset, and you can squeeze the front brake and move the bike forward and backwards, and you should not feel any play in the headset. You don't want to over tighten it. You don't want to press those bearings too much. You just want to get it snug so there's no play. The final step is to just tighten the pinch bolts on the stem. And you want to look up your torque specs for your stem. Sometimes they're even on the stem itself. Usually it's only about 5 Newton meters. This is a carbon stem. And so what I'm doing is I am just tightening each of these a quarter turn. Once they start grabbing, just a quarter turn. You want to tighten these very evenly. Do not tighten one down all the way and then go tighten the other one. Just do it very evenly, a quarter turn at a time, until you've gotten them to the proper torque specs. And that is all there is to removing and reinstalling the bearings, and also removing and reinstalling a fork. Okay, we're done.